December 18th, 1944, Camp Albona. Iowa. Morning frost clung to the barbed wire like frozen lace, glittering under a pale winter sun. 16-year-old Ralph Becker knelt in the frozen dirt of the recreation yard, his breath misting in air so cold it burned his lungs. His fingers, raw and red, traced the outline of something he hadn't thought about in years across. Above him, an American guard stood in the watchtower, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching in silence. Ralph expected a shout, a warning, perhaps worse. Instead, the guard simply nodded and turned away. In that moment, Ralph realized something impossible. The enemy understood what he was trying to build, and they were going to let him do it. Before we continue, if you're finding this story meaningful, hit that like button and subscribe to keep these untold chapters of World War II alive. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's Berlin, Boston, or Brisbane. Your support ensures these voices from history continue to be heard. Now, let's return to Iowa, 1944. Ralph stared at the guards retreating back, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd been a prisoner for 4 months. He'd learned the rhythms of captivity, the commands, the routines, the invisible lines you didn't cross. But this was different. This was permission for something sacred, something human, and it came from the men who defeated him, captured him, shipped him across an ocean to a land so abundant it felt like a different universe entirely. The contradiction made his chest tighten. He looked down at the cross he'd sketched in the dirt and wondered if he'd just witnessed the first small crack in the wall that separated enemies from human beings. The boys of Camp Albona were never supposed to exist. By December 1944, the Third Reich had been scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel for 2 desperate years. The Hitler Youth, once a propaganda showcase of camping trips, nationalist songs, and torch-lit rallies, had transformed into a conscription pool for the Wehrmacht. Boys who should have been solving equations in warm classrooms were instead learning to load Panzerfausts in frozen trenches. Teenagers who dreamed of university now dreamed only of surviving the next artillery barrage. The Volkssturm, the People's Storm, swept up every male between 15 and 60 who could hold a rifle. Germany was feeding its children into the furnace, and the furnace was burning out. Ralph Becker had been 15 when they handed him a uniform in Stuttgart. The tunic hung loose on his narrow shoulders. The boots were 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper to keep them from sliding off his feet. His rifle was a captured Soviet Mosin Nagant, its stock carved with Cyrillic letters he couldn't read and didn't understand. They gave him 3 weeks of training, barely enough time to learn how to march in formation and not shoot himself, and sent him to France in August 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy had turned the Western Front into a nightmare of retreat and encirclement. German units dissolved like salt in water. Ralph lasted 6 days before his position was overrun near Falaise. He surrendered to a Canadian corporal who looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. The corporal was maybe 22. Ralph was still growing into his frame, his voice still cracking when he spoke. The Canadian shook his head and muttered something Ralph didn't understand. But the tone was clear enough. What kind of nation sends children to war? They shipped him across the Atlantic with 300 other prisoners, most of them boys like him, hollow-eyed, exhausted, shaking from shock and malnutrition. The ocean crossing felt like traveling to another planet. America was incomprehensible. The abundance violated every lesson Ralph had learned about scarcity and sacrifice. The guards ate white bread with every meal. They threw away food that would have fed a German family for a week. The trucks never seemed to run out of gasoline. The lights stayed on all night. For boys raised on ration cards and air raid sirens, it was almost offensive. How do you fight a nation that wastes more than you produce? How do you win a war against an enemy who doesn't understand hunger? Camp Algona sat in the flat agricultural heart of Iowa, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The camp had been built to house 5,000 prisoners of war, mostly Germans, captured in North Africa and Italy, seasoned veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps and the Italian campaign. By late 1944, it was overflowing. The child soldiers arrived in November, gaunt and scared, many still wearing the remnants of their Hitler Youth uniforms beneath their Wehrmacht coats. The older prisoners looked at them with complicated expressions: contempt, sorrow, guilt. These were the Volkssturm babies, the last desperate gamble of a dying regime. Some of the veteran Poe's men who'd fought at El Alamein and Monte Cassino refused to speak to them. They represented everything that had gone wrong with the war. Others took them under their wing, teaching them how to navigate camp life, how to stay warm, how to keep your mind occupied when every day felt the same, how to survive captivity without losing yourself entirely. The Americans separated the youngest boys into their own barracks and assigned them lighter work details. Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Tollefson commanded Camp Algona. He was a farmer's son from Minnesota, a man who understood winter and hardship and the rhythms of rural life. He walked through the camp every morning, observing, listening, making mental notes. He saw the way the teenage prisoners huddled together for warmth. He noticed how they flinched at loud noises. He understood, perhaps better than they did themselves, that these were children who'd been fed into a machine and spit out broken. The Geneva Convention was clear about the treatment of prisoners of war. They were to be housed, fed, protected from harm. Religious observance was a protected right, but the convention said nothing about compassion, nothing about dignity, nothing about what to do when the enemy turned out to be someone's son, nothing about what to do when the enemy turned out to be someone's son. As December arrived and snow began to fall in earnest, something shifted in the camp. The German prisoners, young and old alike, grew quieter, more introspective. Christmas was coming. For many of them, it would be their first away from home. For the boys, it might be their first real Christmas at all. The Nazi Party had spent years trying to strip Christianity from German culture, replacing it with pagan solstice festivals and party ideology. The Hitler Youth had been taught to worship strength and the fatherland, not a carpenter's son born in a manger. But memory is stubborn. Despite the propaganda, despite the war, despite everything, the boys remembered fragments, candlelight, hymns sung in cold churches, the smell of pine and cinnamon, mothers who still whispered prayers when the party officials weren't listening. In the frozen monotony of captivity, those memories became precious. They became lifelines to a world before uniforms and battlefields. Ralph Becker was not a leader. He was quiet, bookish when given the chance, better with his hands than his words. But on December 10th, he did something that changed the camp. He went to the wire and asked to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Tollefson. The American officer arrived 20 minutes later, his coat dusted with fresh snow. Ralph stood at attention, his English halting but determined. He asked permission to build a nativity scene. Nothing elaborate, he explained, just something small, a reminder of home, of something bigger than the war, something that hadn't been destroyed yet. Tollefson studied the boy for a long moment. Ralph expected rejection. The Americans were pragmatic, secular, focused on winning the war. Why would they allow enemy prisoners to celebrate a German holiday? Why would they care about the spiritual needs of boys who'd been trying to kill their soldiers 6 months ago? The lieutenant colonel's answer was unexpected. "How big were you thinking?" Ralph blinked, uncertain he'd understood. "Sir?" "The nativity scene." "How big?" Ralph's mind raced. Maybe 3 meters. We could use scraps, whatever we can find." Tollefson shook his head slowly. "If you're going to build something, build it right. I'll get you proper lumber. You'll need paint, too. And tools. Make me a list." Ralph stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. This was the enemy. These were the people who'd bombed German cities into rubble, who'd killed his friends, who'd taken him prisoner and shipped him across an ocean, and they were offering to help him build a church. Something inside Ralph's chest cracked open. He managed to nod, barely trusting his voice. Tollefson turned to leave, then paused. "Make it something worth looking at, son." The news spread through the camp like electricity. The older prisoners were skeptical. It had to be a trick, a test of loyalty, some kind of psychological game. But Tollefson was true to his word. 3 days later, a truck arrived loaded with oak planks, 2x4s, sheets of plywood, paint cans in red, blue, gold, and white, brushes, saws, hammers, nails, and the prisoners had seen in years. The American guards helped unload it all, stacking the lumber near the recreation yard where construction would take place. One guard, a private from Wisconsin, caught Ralph's eye and grinned. "Merry Christmas, kid." Ralph didn't know how to respond. He nodded and turned away before the emotion showed on his face. For the first time since his surrender, he felt something other than shame. He felt purpose. The construction began on December 14th. Ralph organized a team of 12 boys, most of them between 15 and 17. None of them were carpenters, but hunger and war had taught them resourcefulness. They sketched designs in the dirt, argued over proportions, made mistakes, and started over. The older prisoners watched with guarded interest, occasionally offering advice in gruff tones. The nativity scene took shape slowly. They built at half-scale, large enough to be impressive, but small enough to be manageable. The stable came first, a simple structure with rough-hewn beams and a peaked roof. They carved the figures by hand, Mary and Joseph, the infant Jesus, shepherds, wise men, animals. The faces were crude but earnest, each one bearing the fingerprints of boys who'd forgotten what it meant to create something beautiful. Their hands remembered what their minds had tried to forget. The work was exhausting. The cold bit through their thin coats. Their hands blistered and bled. But for the first time since their capture, they felt useful, purposeful, human. The Americans watched with quiet fascination. Off-duty guards stopped by to observe the progress. Some offered suggestions. One brought a photograph of his family's nativity set back home in Illinois, showing the boys how his mother arranged the figures. Another donated a small box of gold leaf he'd been saving, enough to paint halos and the Star of Bethlehem. The boundaries between captor and captive began to blur in small, almost imperceptible ways. A shared glance, a nod of approval. The universal language of craftsmanship transcending the language of war. Local civilians began to hear about the project. Iowa was a deeply religious state, its towns built around church steeples and community faith. The idea of enemy prisoners building a nativity scene was strange, unsettling, but also strangely moving. A farmer's wife from the town of Algona drove out to the camp with a donation of candles, dozens of them, enough to light the entire scene. A Lutheran pastor offered to loan the camp a Bible, a German translation he'd inherited from his grandmother. Lieutenant Colonel Tollefson watched it all unfold with careful attention. He understood the delicate balance he was walking. These were enemy combatants, prisoners of a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities, but they were also children, victims in their own way. And Christmas had a way of cutting through politics. If a wooden stable could give them some measure of peace, some reminder that the world contained more than war, then perhaps it was worth the risk. The scene was completed on December 22nd. The boys stood back and assessed their work with critical eyes. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off. Some of the paint had run in the cold, but it was theirs. They'd built it with their own hands, and in doing so they'd built something else, a fragile bridge between who they'd been and who they might become. That evening they held a small dedication ceremony. Ralph, who'd started it all, was chosen to light the first candle. His hand shook as he struck the match. The flame caught, flickered, and held. One by one, the other candles were lit until the stable glowed in the December darkness, warm and golden against the snow. The scene looked like something from a memory, like something from before the war. The German prisoners gathered in a loose semicircle, silent at first. Then one voice began to sing, "Still Nacht, heilig Nacht." The melody was fragile, almost whispered, but others joined until the cold air filled with song. The American guards stood back. Some removed their helmets. A few sang along in English, the same melody, different words. The war was still raging across Europe and the Pacific. But here, in a POW camp in Iowa, something small and vital took shape. The song hung in the air like a shared prayer. Word spread quickly. By December 23rd, civilians arrived from nearby towns. The commander opened the gates for limited visits. Farmers, teachers, pastors, grieving mothers, and curious children walked through the camp under guard supervision. They stood before the half-scale nativity, studying the hand-carved figures glowing by candlelight. Many had sons fighting the same army these boys once served. The contradiction should have been unbearable, yet it wasn't. The enemy had faces, hands that could build, faith, however, buried. Mothers who had taught them the same hymns. Visitors brought gifts, cookies, still warm, extra candles. A Catholic priest requested a Christmas Eve service, approved on the condition it remain inclusive. The prisoners expected hatred. Instead, they found something harder to understand, recognition. On Christmas Eve, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees. Floodlights were dimmed. Candlelight took over. More than 2,000 people gathered, prisoners, guards, civilians, standing shoulder to shoulder in the snow. The nativity story was read in English, then in German. Hymns followed, sung in both tongues. Same songs, same faith, Ralph stood near the front, thinking of his mother, of surrender, of dignity unexpectedly granted. Around him, enemies stood together, silent, remembering what war had tried to erase, that before nations, before uniforms, they were human, that grace required no flag. The priest spoke the final blessing in Latin, the ancient words that transcended nationality. Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax hominibus bon voluntatis. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men of good will. Peace. The word hung in the frozen air like something impossible. There was no peace. The war ground on, relentless and cruel, consuming lives and cities and futures. But here, for one night, in a prisoner of war camp surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, peace existed in miniature. It wasn't a treaty or an armistice. It was something simpler and more profound. It was recognition. Humanity acknowledged across enemy lines. It was the realization that the person across the wire wasn't just a target or an abstraction. He was also someone's son, someone who remembered Christmas, someone who could still pray. After Christmas, life at Camp Algona returned to routine. Prisoners worked. Guards watched. The war continued its grim arithmetic, but something had changed. The nativity scene remained standing through January, its candles relit each evening by different hands. American guards and German prisoners tended it together, replacing candles, brushing snow from the roof, keeping the figures upright. No order required it. They did it because it mattered, because they had built something together, and that memory deserved care. Ralph Becker was repatriated in March 1946. He returned to Stuttgart to find his mother alive and their apartment still standing amid ruins. He never forgot Iowa, the officer who gave him lumber, or the night enemies sang together in the snow. He became a carpenter, building homes instead of fortifications. He told his children that even in captivity, something sacred could still be built. Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Tollefson returned to his Minnesota farm. He never spoke publicly of the nativity scene, considering it small, but he kept a photograph on his desk until his death teenage prisoners beside their creation, candlelight in their eyes. Not joy, not peace, something closer to hope. The nativity was dismantled in February 1945, its lumber reused. Nothing physical remained. But the story endured, passed down as a quiet Iowa legend about a Christmas when the war paused, when enemies built instead of destroyed. History remembers battles and treaties, but it is also shaped by smaller acts, lumber donated, candles lit, strangers singing together. The stable in the snow reminded them that the person across the wire was someone's son. Someone who remembered Christmas, someone still human. For one improbable season, boys trained for war built a church, and in doing so they proved that even in winter, even in captivity, grace can survive.